If you're visiting with us, we really appreciate your presence this morning. What we're doing is looking at the Gospels, and we're striving to do that in chronological order. So I know that's a little bit of a challenge for us sometimes, but I encourage you as you are doing your studying to look at these passages. We look at Matthew 9, beginning with verse 9, Mark chapter 2, verse 13, and Luke chapter 5. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke all deal with this particular story or incident in time here in reference particularly to the selecting of Matthew to be one of the apostles. And it's curious to me and interesting as well as to what the different writers mention and what they don't mention. And I think that this shows how God allowed them, even though they were led by the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, and what we have, we are assured is God's message. Yet the personalities of the writers, of their backgrounds, are brought into this as well in reference to the way that they wrote and the things particularly that they seem to emphasize. They obviously were like we are. What catches your attention might not catch mine. What maybe seems more vital to you might not seem all that important to me, and vice versa. So it's interesting as we look at this to sort of piece it together. And I also realize that when we look at what Matthew has to say, although the point is easy and we gain from that, when we are rightly dividing the Scriptures, it's important that we look at all that is said on a particular topic or a particular idea, so that we make sure that the conclusion that we make or come up with is indeed according to what the Word of God actually teaches. And not only looking at it in chronological order, but something that we've talked about a little bit is in reference to different translations also. I know most of us still are using the Old King James. A lot of us are using now the New King James, but some of the other translations that have some pretty obvious faults or problems in certain areas, and yet sometimes the reading in some of them is truer to the original, or at least it's easier for us to perceive and understand it. So that's something that you might want to think about, and if you don't already do that, is to look at more than one translation of the Scripture with reference to a particular passage. I want us to begin this morning by simply reading a few verses from Matthew 9. We'll begin with verse 9 through verse 13. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." So he rose and followed him. Now it happened as Jesus sat at the table in the house. With that verse, if you look at the other two passages, we know that it was Matthew that invited Jesus into his house. Although this doesn't per se say that, but if you look at what Mark says and what Luke says, we know that Matthew invited him home with him. Now it happened as Jesus sat at the table in the house, in Levi's or Matthew's house. And that's another point too. We bring in the idea of Levi, Matthew, Levi. One name, combination of those two names, and the other two passages bring that to light as well. Behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and sat down with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And Jesus heard that. He said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." Out of the numerous lessons I think that we find in this passage, it strikes me as we're working our way through this study that the Pharisees and the scribes particularly, they're mentioned a whole lot more than the Sadducees. Occasionally they're brought into the picture. But it's just like a sort of a watchdog group. It seems that they're just following Jesus around for no other reason than to find fault. You notice that? And, you know, I pray that we're not like that. It is sometimes a temptation for us to do that. And we would justify it, I think, sometimes by saying, you know, we want to stick with the Bible and want to make sure that the truth is being taught. Well, that is something that we must do. We are to rightly divide the Scriptures. We're to be like the Bereans in Acts 17. You know, receive the Word with all readiness, but at the same time, you know, search the Scriptures daily to make sure that what's being preached and taught is true. But there is the danger that we would go to the extreme there, where we would find fault with almost anything, and we might go to the extreme of trying to justify something in the area of opinion to the abuse of that. So we need to study, we need to watch, we need to insist in our own lives and the lives of others that we're sticking with the Bible, and yet not go to the point to where maybe we're just always finding fault and we're always looking for something that is wrong. Of course, the Pharisees, they sort of had an agenda. Jesus was taking away the attention that they craved and desired, and he was getting more followers and more attention than they were at this particular period of time. But we find them here, and we find them in almost every story. That they're watching, they're looking to find fault, they're looking to condemn in some way. So I think that it behooves us to look at ourselves and make sure that we're not just fault finders, that we're not, you know, just looking to pass judgment, that we are truly truth seekers, and that we're looking for the truth and following to the very best of our ability. And he brings into this particular story the tax collector. And of course, it's interesting, and we've talked about this a little bit already, also in the selection that Jesus made of the apostles. And if you and I had been doing this, likely we would not have accepted this group. When you think about Peter, Andrew, James, and John, which seem to kind of be the foundation of the apostles, particularly Peter and John, here they were fishermen, you know, they worked out on the sea, basically no education, no real connection to the Jewish hierarchy as far as Jerusalem and that type of thing is concerned. And now you have somebody like Matthew that was pretty much hated and despised because of his work, because that he collected taxes for the Roman government. And so when the Pharisees, particularly, when they looked at sinners, lots of times you have them combined with tax collectors. They thought that was about the lowest thing that a person could do. They looked upon the tax collectors as traitors. They turned away from the Jews and the Jewish nation, and they were actually working for the enemy. They were actually working for the Roman government. Also, from some statements that were made later by Zacchaeus and other passages, it sounds like that this office was one that was abused. Aren't you glad that government offices aren't abused today? Yeah, every way you turn, right? People are abusing or taking or stealing or whatever. Well, this particular office here evidently was designed in a way that they could overtax, they could overcharge, and seems to have been a pretty common practice. Now, Jesus selecting Matthew, just by that very fact, I think it tells us that Matthew was not in that camp. He did his job, but he did it honestly, and he did it according to the law. But by the fact that Jesus selected him, it really brought a great deal of criticism in reference to the way that the folks looked at that and thought about it. So tax collectors were the worst of the worst in their opinion. Now, a lesson for us there. We may also be guilty in some ways. And, we mentioned, you have all of these jokes about different public officials, and there's a lot of lawyer jokes, and I remember there was one you referenced, when is a lawyer not lying, and then don't go from there. Or the blonde jokes, with the ladies. There are things like that, and then of course you bring in prejudice in reference not only to work, but skin color, nationality, and that type of thing. So this problem is an age-old problem of people condemning because of who a person is, or the type of work that they do, or their family background, where they live, which part of town they live in, how they were raised, and all of that stuff is so very, very unfair. Jesus, of course, knew the heart, and he had that advantage over us. He knew the hearts, and he knew what was there, and he also knew the potential. Peter really struggled in his transformation, didn't he? From an old rough fisherman, we know that he cursed and swore on one occasion. He denied knowing the Lord on one occasion. He pulled his sword out to fight on an occasion. And then later, when he should have known much, much better, he was rebuked by the Apostle Paul because he was associating with the Gentiles, and then when certain Jewish hierarchy showed up, he took off and acted as if he had nothing to do with the Gentiles. So Peter struggled, but Peter was that rock. He was the one that preached that first gospel sermon in Acts chapter 2 there. He had the makings. And I think when you get particularly to 1st and 2nd Peter and the writings there, you can see what the Lord saw in Peter, the man that he had become. So here, I think, is a lesson for us in reference to not passing judgment on people, but to preach the gospel, to invite, to encourage, to teach, and allow them to make the decision as to what they will do with it, rather than us determining up front they wouldn't be interested, or they wouldn't listen, or they wouldn't have anything to do with it. And there is that tendency for us to do that. Anybody with a thought? Anything in these verses? Tony? Amen. And that's what the beauty of the body, isn't it? It's the beauty of the body of Christ. And, that's one of the things that all of us should give God thanks for every day. There is a place for me. There's a place for me. No matter where I come from, no matter how bad I've been, no matter, my education, my background, my parents, all of those things play into who I am and play into who you are, but there's a place on the vine. There's a place in the body, and you're exactly right. I think when you look at the apostles, obviously the Lord knowing their hearts, but those backgrounds. What did he say to Peter, Andrew, James, and John? I'm going to make you fishers of men. And there's a lot can be learned by fishing. Patience for one thing. You learn that. You learn to go where the fish are at. You learn that certain bait works and does not work. Well, same way with people, isn't it? You go to find the people. You find an approach that will work. The approach that will work with you or the bait might not be very appetizing to me at all. So you see that. You see Matthew in his position. You see Thomas, who was a doubter, and yet he had evidently qualities that he was praised for. And then later, the Apostle Paul, and we talked about this a little bit, to not maybe downplay education. Paul was highly educated under Gamaliel, and he had the ability, because of his education and because of his position as a Pharisee, to do some things that Peter, doors would have been shut for Peter, let's put it that way, or others. So they were uniquely qualified, but at the same time they were just everyday people like us. And they had the qualities that the Lord knew that they had to be successful and to continue to preach and teach after Jesus was crucified and went back to heaven. It's a good point. Anybody else with a thought there? Yeah, I wanted to make a point off of verse 11 particularly. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to his disciples, not to Jesus, do we ever do that? We've got a question or a disagreement, but we don't talk to the person. We talk to everybody else. It's just the way we are sometimes. It's not right. But they didn't talk to Jesus. They didn't say, hey, wait a minute here. They talked to his disciples. Of course, the unique thing was Jesus knew their hearts, and he knew what they were thinking without them saying it. But if we've got a question, if we've got a concern, if we've got a misunderstanding, if we've got a disagreement, we need to go to each other. And we need to trust each other well enough that we could do that. And we need to be the kind of people that, you could talk to. We all know that there are folks that if you say anything with a disagreement, they're going to get mad. They're going to blow up. They're going to, we shouldn't be those kind of people. We should be the kind of person that will listen, the kind of person that's open enough to learn. And when we're honest, we all know that we make mistakes, right? We all say things or we do things at times that are not what they ought to be. And so being corrected is a part of who we are. But we need to accept that properly. The point I wanted to make was in verse 11, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? I think right here is a key to the fact that they had forgotten who they were. The Pharisees were sinners as well, right? And yet they didn't seem to look at themselves that way. They looked at themselves as the faithful. They looked at themselves as the righteous. And they made this statement numerous times in the New Testament as it's recorded. And it's like they forgot that God loves the lost, and he wants the lost to be saved. So they put themselves here, and then they got everybody else somewhere else. Well, there's that danger for us to do that as well. Because we're here on Sunday morning and others are not here, we put ourselves in one category and them in another. Well, in a sense, that's true. But the bottom line is we're all sinners, right? Now, there are saved sinners and there are lost sinners. But the bottom line is all of us need forgiveness, and we need forgiveness every day. And we should not put ourselves up here on a pedestal. Yes, we may not be doing some of the bad things that the world is doing. Our sins, and we talked about I guess that was Wednesday night where we talked about white lies and black lies, you know, that type of thing. And, you know, we need to recognize that sin is sin. Obviously, consequences of it here and now can be much more taxing and much more, I don't know what term I want to use, but the consequences are greater with certain sins than others. But the bottom line is we are sinners as well. We are sinners preaching to sinners. We're teachers as sinners teaching sinners all in need of God's salvation, His grace and His mercy and His forgiveness. So by asking this question, it appears at least that they were missing the point as to exactly who they were. And we need to be aware of that danger there as well. Anybody else with a thought there? Yeah, that's a good point, and hopefully we don't say, forget Peter, but I get your point. You know, I think part of that is because Paul wrote so much of the New Testament. And you know, so much of what we would preach and teach is taken from him. Peter, of course, did some writing. John did some writing. Others were not, you know, from Thomas and Philip and others, you know, we don't have anything written from them. So I think that that's probably natural, but you're exactly right. And I guess that's our point. We need to be careful about elevating one person over another. The fact that we don't know a lot of what Bartholomew, for example, did doesn't mean that he did not do a great service as an apostle. We just don't know. We don't have anything recorded. So, yes, we can do that. And in fact, some have tried to play Paul against Jesus and back and forth because of some of the writings and things, and it's not something that we ought to do. Anybody else? Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Could be. And we all have our favorites too that we like to read from. When we were on vacation, the Sunday night sermon that the preacher was just starting a series on 1 John. And that was interesting because that's what we're doing at Bible camp this year with the kids. We're using 1 John as our text. And this introduction was so very interesting because the preacher made the point that John and Paul are very, very different in the way that they write. And he noted that many times if you look at Paul's writings, Paul pretty much makes, you know, point number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and you got a conclusion. Now, knowing Paul, he may make 20 points and then a conclusion. He would never have passed Tom Holland's preacher class because Brother Holland told us to have 3 or 4 points, so the Apostle Paul would have failed. You know, he had 20 points, he had 30 points, but that's the way that he did it. Now, when you get into 1 John, John doesn't do that at all. John writes more about the way that we ought to feel about a thing. But what he'll do in chapter 1 is bring up an idea, talk about it a little bit, and then he just jumps to another topic. Well, then you get over to the end of chapter 3, and just out of the blue, he brings that topic up again. You know, say, wait, where'd this come from? And then he'll leave it, and he'll over in chapter 5, he'll come back to it again. So, studying 1 John is challenging for us because most of us, our minds don't do that. Although we all know some people that never finish a story before they start another one, right? You can never get them to finish what they're getting at. But so Paul, I think, many times is more of a favorite because it's easier for our minds to follow that and to follow the thought and then get the conclusion and say, okay, got that. John didn't do that, at least not the way that Paul did it. So I think so. Our personalities, a lot of us can relate to Peter as a person because of the mistakes that he made. So, you know, that's just kind of the way it is. Yeah, it was Andrew, wasn't it? Yeah, good point. Yes. Same thing with us, right? I mean, no. Right. And when we look at ourselves, we shouldn't forget that. You know, where are we today? Where were we? You know, where were we? And God, through His grace and His mercy, has allowed us to progress and grow and develop. Now, let's apply that to evangelism. You know, there is that tendency. You know, we want the drunk to quit drinking first. You know, we want him to take a bath. We want him to get out of the gutter. We want him to get better clothes and income. It doesn't always work that way, does it? You know, Jesus attracted the prostitute. He attracted those that, as he states here, that really needed a physician. Were they still in that line of work when they first came? Most likely. Did they quit immediately? Probably not. But through the teaching and the preaching and the process, they changed their habits and they changed their lives. And we've got to remember that as well, that folks have to learn, and they have to grow, and they have to develop. And we're thankful that that's been the case with us. So we need to make sure that we don't forget that in our dealings with other people as well. Okay, let's go to that next section. We'll just stay right there in Matthew 9. And in this particular section, Mark and Luke both pretty much in the same chapters. In Mark chapter 2 and Luke chapter 5, you find the parallel passages here. But verse 14 of Matthew 9, then the disciples of John came to him saying, why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast? Just a quick thought there. We've already talked quite a bit about John the Baptist, who's having reference to here, and the fact that some of the apostles, it seems that Andrew, John, likely were disciples of John, and then when John taught about Christ and Christ came to the picture, made that transition. But John was fading out, and Jesus is coming into prominence here. And John, as we've noted, was a very special individual as that forerunner, aware, no doubt, that he was to fade away. He was simply opening the door. He was the opening act, okay, at a concert. He was there to sort of get things set, but he was not the main act that people were to come to see. So he still has his disciples, and these disciples are beginning to learn. Well, John and the disciples there were fasting, and the Pharisees made note of this, said, but your disciples do not. Jesus said to them, can the friends of the bridegroom mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come and the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast. Just a thought there too. I think that it suggests that fasting many times had to do with sorrow. And we'll find numerous examples of that in the New Testament, that it was attached many times to sorrow. And Jesus sort of hints at that. He says, no one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch pulls away from the garment and the tear is made worse. Nor do they put new wine into old wineskins, or else the wineskins break, the wine is spilled, and the wineskins are ruined. But they put new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved. Now, two very distinct thoughts here. One has to do, obviously, with fasting. In the New Testament, you don't find fasting being a command or a requirement. Jesus, when he talked about it, seemed to just assume that people at times would fast, maybe at the time of a death in the family or whatever. And it was not, fasting was not per se commanded in the Old Testament either, with the exception of the, I meant to make that, was it the Feast of Tabernacles particularly? There was one of the feasts, yeah, in Leviticus 16:31, Day of Atonement. The Hebrews were to afflict their souls, which normally is making reference to fasting according to Isaiah 58 and verse 3. So fasting was something that they did, but the Pharisees had moved it into the category of something that you had to do in order to be faithful to God. Now, this is also an example that should warn us against making something that is an opinion, something that is not wrong, something that may very well be good for us, but making it a life or death, right or wrong, heaven or hell type of situation. And that's where fasting was at. It was not something that they had to do, and it was never commanded for them to do it. Now, if they did it, they were to be careful about how they did it. Jesus talked about that, and he basically indicated that it was to be a private matter, where the Pharisees had evidently gotten to the point to where they would disfigure the faces maybe with makeup. And they wanted everybody to know that they were fasting. Same way with their prayers. You remember they would stand out on the street corners? Jesus said, go where? Go in your room, your closet. You know, it was to be a private matter. The praying wasn't wrong. Long prayers were not wrong. Fasting was not wrong. But it was wrong to be hypocritical. It was wrong to put on show and to try to appear to be something that you were not. And the Pharisees, at times at least, were guilty of that. So their they're looking upon this as something that had to be done in order to please God, and that simply was not the case. Jesus indicated that when the time was right, no doubt his disciples would fast, and that would have to do particularly with his death and burial as an example there. Anybody with a thought or question on the fasting idea before we look at the second thought here? Because the second thought, particularly, that he turns to has to do with the putting new wine in old wineskins and that type of thing. Well, basically, this is the point in the ministry where persecution is really going to begin to take off. Jesus has received some persecution up to this point, but nothing like what's going to happen from this point forward until his crucifixion. And what he does is he gives basically three reasons here behind the change and how he's going to be perceived. Number one, his message is what he's talking about when he's talking about the new wine. His message was new, and it did not fit particularly the traditional way in reference to fasting and some other things that these folks had been accustomed to practicing as Jews. So he's saying rather than patching up the old practices with something new that did not match them and would cause considerable disruption, he says a new garment is needed. He's making reference to what he's preaching and teaching, and this is a new covenant. It is a new law. It's the gospel of Christ. And these folks are going to struggle with that. And many of them are going to try to put the two together. They're going to try to hang on to the old law. And at the time that they're making the transition to the new law. Jesus was talking about the changes that are going to have to be made. And his remarks apply, I think, to the law of Moses, but also to some of the Jewish transitions. You can go over to Hebrews chapter 8. Hebrews chapter 8, verses 1 through 13, and I think it sort of sets the background here to what Jesus is getting at. And also in Mark chapter 7, the first few verses will deal with that as well. I'm sorry we don't have time to finish that, but we'll try to do that next Sunday morning. But think about these verses. You go back this afternoon or tomorrow in your personal study and look at this in light of the changes that Jesus is going to make and the fact that he's indicating that, you know, it's not a combining the old with the new. It's not a putting the new covenant was not a patch on the old, but it was something that was completely new. And this was going to be hard for them. This was going to be a difficult transition. Appreciate your comments this morning.